Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I believe you're going to be in for a real treat. We have with us David Miller. He's an economist. He's actually quite famous for being the former mayor of Toronto, and he's currently working at the C40 Centre. I've put a link to that in the chat, so that'll be available to anybody who wants to go directly to it later. David's going to enlighten us today on what's been happening with the center, but more importantly, what's been happening with cities around the world regarding climate change. I note that in 2005, 18 cities came together and they actually called themselves the C20. By 2006, it became the C40, but there are actually about 100 cities that are currently members of this. And they also have started a program called the Race to Zero, which has over 1,000 cities that are participating in it. So I expect we're going to hear some really great things today. Enjoy the show. Over to you, David.
Good morning and good afternoon, and I think good evening to some. Thank you very much for the invitation today to speak about city-based climate action, which I view from my perspective, not just from somebody who had a 16-year privilege of being an elected official in the city of Toronto, but as someone who's worked with cities globally for the past 20 years probably on the challenge of climate change. And the title of my talk is, while nations talk, cities act. The thesis I'm going to advance today to you is that it's extremely urgent to act on climate change, that science tells us very clearly that if we are going to stop climate breakdown, and by that the scientific consensus is we need to keep average global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees or less, we need to have overall global emissions by 2030. That means we can't wait for promises to do things by 2050, which many countries have made and some businesses. And it means really we have to act now and over the next 8 years in order to dramatically reduce emissions. And from my perspective, that means that what we need to do is take the best ideas that are happening somewhere and do them everywhere if we're going to have any chance whatsoever of doing that. And to me, that means relying on what's happening in our cities and urban areas, typically as a result of city leadership, but it could include actions by others within our urban areas. And I'll explain why I believe all of that, what's happening to make you optimistic, some concerns, and then I look forward to questions. And I've been told to try to keep my remarks to 45 minutes, so I will do my best to keep that. So if you want to investigate a bit more about this, I've written a book which came out before Glasgow last fall, but highlights the ideas and the argument I'm advancing, and really looks at what's happening in some of the world's great cities about the climate crisis. I don't think I need to tell anyone on this call that climate change is serious, but if we look at what's happening globally, it's really extraordinary. This is just some things from last year, but it's incredible. And, in Canada, certainly on the West Coast in British Columbia, we know very, very well the terrible impacts of climate change with, Lytton, British Columbia burning down in literally 15 minutes, and then massive, massive flooding happening in the same area and elsewhere just a few months later. Extreme weather events are happening more and more and more. And, we're a relatively affluent country. It's causing billions of dollars of damage here. An incredible dislocation to people and to nature. It's shot from Europe, but think about the impact in places like Africa and elsewhere. And here's a little note about the wildfire season in BC 2 years ago, and things are no better. So here's what science tells us, and this is a scientific consensus of 99% of the world's climate scientists. In fact, I actually get a little bit nervous because the UN process of bringing people together around a common viewpoint tends to try to reach consensus, and from my perspective, if anything, understates the risk. So we know that 3 degrees, is extremely significant for the planet. 2 degrees is problematic. 1.5 is the best hope we have, and it's very much touch and go whether the world can keep to 1.5 degrees. One of the things that I see from my perspective, if we do end up with 3 degrees of warming, the impact in places like sub-Saharan Africa on food production would be immense. And if you think about how difficult and destabilizing it was for our political institutions in Europe and Canada and the United States, perhaps a bit less so in Canada, but certainly the United States and Europe, to try to accommodate the flow of refugees from Syria, which is a few million people. Think about what might happen if tens, if not hundreds of millions of people are on the move in Africa because there's no food. And that is literally a risk of global warming, let alone all of the issues with ocean temperature increase, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So climate breakdown is coming. It's urgent. We need to keep on a path to 1.5 degrees. And from my perspective, the place that is most likely to help us get on that path is in our cities. And why? Well, first of all, for the first time since recorded history of human settlements, in about 2008 or 9, we passed the point where more people in the world are urban residents than are not. So from the dawn of human settlements until about 10 years ago, the world was predominantly rural. From 10 years ago, going forward on a path that is rapidly increasing urbanization because of the massive influx of people to cities in India and Africa and the huge conurbations in China. From 10 years ago going forward, we're an urban world. And that's a fundamental change to the world. And it means not only are most people in the world, and I'm sorry about the layout of this slide, going from PowerPoint to Google Slides and back seems to have slightly screwed it up. Most people are in the world. Most of our are in cities, 55% now. Most of our economy is in cities. Most of our CO2 emissions are in cities. Most energy consumes in cities. And worryingly, urban expansion in developing countries is near hazard-prone areas at serious risk of threat from changes to our climate. So cities are where the people are, the economy is, and the carbon pollution is. And of course, like any problem, you want to address the problem where it occurs. So our network, as was mentioned in the introduction, C40 Cities, where I currently work as the managing director of our internal think tank, the Center for Urban Policy and Economy, is a network of nearly 100 of the world's greatest cities. And it was started in 2005 by then Mayor Ken Livingstone of London, based on the idea that the voices and the actions of the mayors of the world's greatest cities could help the world avoid dangerous climate change. From the beginning, that idea that the voices of these mayors are powerful and their actions are powerful, and together they're extremely significant, has been the founding and core principle and the way we work. There's also a second founding principle, which was that half of the cities would be from the global north and half from the global south. So we see cities like Moscow, Sydney, Australia, Cape Town, Johannesburg, Addis, London, Paris, Buenos Aires, Beijing, Jakarta, and of course Toronto. Toronto is a founding member. I'm rather proud of that. Being members of this network, which is a sole purpose network about climate change using the voices and the actions of those mayors. And in the 15 years of existed, huge amounts been accomplished, and I'll explain that more later. But I think the key for me from this slide is to leave the point that there is a network of these major cities that together have a population, if you include the city regions, of about $700 million. And a huge proportion, our calculations suggest 25% of the world's GDP. So it's like a massive, huge country that's come together to work on this issue. And this is a photo of the mayors taken at our last summit in Copenhagen in 2019 before the pandemic hit, just to demonstrate the breadth and diversity of those mayors. You can see Mayor Valérie Plante there from Montreal in the front row in the blue dress. Beside her is Mayor Garcetti, who was our chair until December. And beside him is Mayor Anne Hidalgo of Paris, who was our chair before Mayor Garcetti and is now running for to replace Mr. Macron in the French elections. So I'll speak in a few minutes about the actual steps that these mayors are taking and why they matter and how the ideas are spreading to other cities. But I think it's important to understand for context the commitments that countries have made. And this ratings tracker was done just before the COP in Glasgow. I don't have an update available to me from the Climate Action Tracker people. When it is, I'll change the slide. But not a lot was changed. Going into the International Conference of the Parties, which, as you all know, it happens every year. This is the 26th one under this particular agreement. There are COPs for other agreements, but under the climate change agreement, the Gambia was the only country that had a climate plan that was Paris compatible. And as we know, in Canada, you can have a plan and not necessarily be following it either. So you can see, Canada is highly insufficient. Even Germany, a lot of the EU countries are insufficient. And then there is a small group of countries that are almost sufficient. That is the context of what's really happening from the commitment perspective, let alone the action perspective, with national governments globally. The vast majority of governments range from critically insufficient to insufficient, and the ones who are almost sufficient or on a 1.5 degree trajectory are the outliers, which is a significant worry. And COP26 in Glasgow, in many ways, was the last chance to try to get those countries to advance their commitments. And essentially, they put off serious action to the next COP. In Egypt, they did make some pledges, ending deforestation, pledges to cut methane. India pledged to be net zero by 2070, which was applauded by some. I personally found that extremely bizarre. How can we possibly be excited that a current elected official is making a pledge to do nothing for 50 years when this is a really serious crisis? I think the US and China cooperation was a useful thing, but what is required now is really action, and bold action. And that's what cities tried to showcase at COP, but more importantly, that's what they're doing on the ground. So this shows you, in a bit of a complicated way, what the paths are, but essentially, we're on a path to somewhere between 2 and 3.5 degrees. If everything is actually done that national governments have committed to, and they're woefully behind, We're somewhere between 1.7 and 2.6. And if you look at the 1.5 degree pathway, which requires virtual halving of emissions globally by 2030, you can see that the path is way below this. And in many places like Canada, essentially emissions have been increasing despite pledges to reduce. So we're at a moment that is extremely concerning and worrying. In contrast to that national government inaction, we see some very interesting leadership from cities, which is what my talk is about today. A group of mayors from Glasgow, just wanted to highlight a couple. Mayor Garcetti is on the other end of the photo, the other end from me. And he was our outgoing, actually I'm wrong about that. Mayor Garcetti is in the middle. Our outgoing chair, right in the middle with a bright green tie, is Mayor Sadiq Khan, the new chair of C40. And to the left, beside the woman in the green, is Mayor Susan Aitken from Glasgow. And if you have not heard her speak, go find a video. She is absolutely brilliant, deeply cares about people, and has a wonderful, wonderful Glaswegian accent when she speaks to issues, including climate. So in Glasgow, we produced a coalition of over 1,000 cities who've all committed to having a climate plan and taking the necessary action that's inclusive and resilient to do their share of keeping overall average temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, which means their fair share of actions to have emissions by 2050. And why does this coalition matter? And is it even possible to have emissions? Yes, it matters because, I'm just going to go back to that slide. It matters because what C40 cities have shown and demonstrated with their actions is that city-based climate plans can work and can lead to really significant greenhouse gas reductions within the urban areas that have such a plan. Our program is called Deadline 2020. It started just after COP21 in Paris. So when national governments reached the Paris Accord, which was groundbreaking, it was fantastic. We were all optimistic in the climate movement about results from Paris, even though the agreement itself scientifically wasn't adequate. People in the climate movement were optimistic because it was the first time there'd been an agreement in 21 years. And now, if you're involved in running a city or city politics, 21 years seems an extraordinary length of time. You know, if there's a problem with a bus route in Hyde Park, Parkdale, and I had said as councillor or mayor, we'll fix it in 21 years, I would not have lasted very long as an elected official. From a city perspective, and one of the reasons cities bring a sense of urgency to climate change is that residents of cities expect their city governments to act in real ways on real policies and actions. And cities have a whole range of tools and responsibilities, different in different countries, but there are many similarities that are exceptionally important environmentally. Typically, they're responsible for transportation. Almost everyone is responsible for waste management. They're responsible for building standards, where buildings can go. They're responsible for parks. They're responsible for urban tree canopies. They're responsible for water and wastewater. They're responsible for public health, which, dealing with air pollution and the impact, the health impact of, for example, a coal-fired power plant, which would cause air pollution problems and asthma, and is also a climate contributor. So cities have a whole range of responsibilities that relate to climate, and residents expect them to undertake those responsibilities and act to make the cities better places to live in real time, not in 20-year segments. So there is both an opportunity for action and an expectation. And our analysis at C40, in addition to that, shows that the 70% of greenhouse gas emissions globally that are in cities tend to be from four segments. from transportation, from how we heat and cool buildings, how we generate our electricity, and how we manage our waste. And in all of those, there are real actions happening somewhere that, if replicated at scale, could make a dramatic difference. So after the Paris Accord, which was COP21 in 2015, C40 cities at their next summit in Mexico made a pledge. And in order to remain a member of C40, you had to commit to making a plan, which we call Deadline 2020, a climate plan that would do your fair share of halving emissions by 2030 on a path to net zero by 2050, which is what science showed. At the time, national governments through Paris were only on a 2-degree trajectory. C40 took the position that our cities as leaders had to be on a 1.5-degree trajectory. And almost all of our cities have honored their commitment to do that. A few, particularly in the developing world, because of COVID and reduced capacity in cities because of COVID, haven't quite yet finished their plans, but the vast majority have. And the results have been extremely important because those plans have driven action in the sectors I spoke to and elsewhere to create cities that have really reduced greenhouse gas emissions. And the plan was, and in addition, the fact that these leading cities were driving a 1.5-degree trajectory demonstrated that it was possible to other governments to do that. And from my perspective, the fact that this group of elected governments representing over 700 million citizens were able to craft 1.5-degree trajectories and succeed demonstrated to the world that it didn't need to be afraid, and has helped lead to the general acceptance that we should be collectively working hard to achieve that goal. Why was it called Deadline 2020? Because in the developed world, science showed that cities needed to peak emissions by 2020. So that's the idea, is Deadline 2020. And what we did was take the principles underlining that program to 1,000 other cities globally and say, essentially, here's the methodology that these great cities, the biggest global cities, have used. Here are the actions they've taken, and we want you to commit to having a climate plan that achieves the same goals and taking actions. And all of these 1,000 cities committed to the areas of actions that they're going to take. The idea being that the big cities broke ground, and now those ideas can spread rapidly globally. One of those ideas is about the electrification of transportation, and at COP, a group of international investors signed a commitment with our ZEBRA program, Zero Emissions Bus Rapid Accelerator, to invest more than $1 billion in electrifying bus fleets in Latin America, as an example of a practical thing that was announced. We launched a new coalition of cities and construction sector companies committed to tackling emissions from the construction sector. Really important, clean construction, not just clean, efficient buildings. And post-COP, the world's first green shipping corridor between ports in the US and China was announced by C40, the Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Shanghai. And I love that photo with the seal there. But they're going to start with one ship because nobody has a zero carbon fueled ship. And they're also going to be very aggressive. Los Angeles is already underway here in electrifying the ports, the transportation around the ports and so forth. So this will be a model to show the globe what zero emission shipping and zero emission ports can look like. Really important because the Port of Shanghai and the Port of Los Angeles are two of the biggest ports in the world. So I've already spoken to Deadline 2020 a little bit. I won't belabor it, but we did a very intensive study with ARA based on carbon budgets, i.e. what is the share of carbon that these cities should be responsible for, and how do we reduce it? And from 2015, when the program started, you can see the line if nothing had happened. And then we're trying to bend the curve through for the kind of actions I spoke to. So how do cities do this? Sometimes they have very direct responsibilities for a sector. So in the energy sector, Los Angeles owns its own utility. It's called the Department of Water and Power. It's really important historically in Los Angeles. It owns the aqueduct, for example, that supplies most of the water. So it's very highly valued as a public utility. It hasn't been privatized. And, in the wave of privatization that happened to utilities, one of the consequences is governments have lost control. And at this time where we need utilities to make a massive transition in the way they generate electricity, it is far more difficult in an industry that was privatized. Los Angeles owns theirs, and they have been able, over a relatively short period of time, to dramatically reduce their reliance on coal. And by somewhere between 2030 and 2035, but very close to 2030, their entire grid will be clean. Now in Ontario and in British Columbia, we're used to this already because of steps taken by the McGuinty government, because of BC's history. But in the United States, that is a very big deal indeed, and it shows globally what is possible, because there is often a pushback. You can't have a zero emissions grid. It's not possible. You've got to have coal as a backup, etc. I'm sure you've heard the arguments, but Los Angeles is proving on the ground that in a major city of over 10 million people, it is entirely possible to go to a zero emissions grid. And they're doing a ton with solar, including rooftop solar in people's houses and in low-income communities. And by the way, they're using those programs to create job opportunities, including training programs for low-income people. Austin, Texas, also owns its utility. It's very interesting programs there. About 12 years ago, maybe 10, through the utility, they were faced with the choice of building a new plant, which at the time probably would have been natural gas, but emits carbon. And the city didn't want to emit carbon; they wanted to lower their carbon. And they did a study that showed it would be cheaper to pay people to insulate their houses rather than building a new power plant. And they were able, as a result of that study and a program that they instituted, to do exactly that. And Austin is a booming city in Texas. Its slogan is "Keep it weird." It's a hive of creativity and IT and all sorts of things, entertainment. It's got a great university there. It's a very progressive city, and it has faced a similar issue recently because of its boom and people moving to Austin. So this time around, it's got a rooftop solar program that it's trying to use to offset the need to build a new power plant. Really interesting examples. But then there are examples of cities in the world who have no control over their electricity grid whatsoever. Toronto's somewhere in between. It controls the distribution of electricity, but not the generation. The turbine you're looking at here was sort of a pilot just to show it was possible, but Exhibition Place does generate as much electricity on site as it consumes through the turbine, the solar, and it has a tri-generator as well. But there are cities that don't even have that power, like Sydney, Australia. And what it has done is create a buying co-op for clean energy because of its commitment to Deadline 2020 and its goals, and because of the importance in generating clean electricity to meeting those climate goals. It's built a buying co-op with other large users like hospitals, universities, and bigger industries. And they have agreed to just buy clean energy. And they're doing that from solar farms in particular, located outside Sydney. So there are all sorts of different approaches to get the same goal. How do we clean our energy grid? Second issue is buildings. There's so much happening in the world in buildings. I could do an entire speech on it for probably an hour and a half, and I'm not even an expert. But the short version is, within most cities, certainly built up ones like New York or Toronto, most of the greenhouse gas emissions, or the preponderance, are from buildings. They're a highly spread out one like Houston, it'll be transportation first, then buildings. But in most cities, the energy used to heat and cool buildings, and the way we build them in the first place, and where we build them for that matter, are the biggest contributor to greenhouse gases. So there's some very interesting programs. The previous mayor of New York, Bill de Blasio, brought in a building mandate that requires larger commercial buildings and will require residential buildings to halve their greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And it's a mandate, it's a legal mandate. So it has to happen. And the city council, interestingly, is looking at having a cap and trade system within New York City. One C40 city, Tokyo, already has such a system set up municipally, not part of a national system, to deal with the emissions from buildings, which is an interesting approach. Vancouver has probably what is the world's leading building code. You're going to need to build only net zero tall buildings by 2030. Why does that matter? Well, tall buildings are the ones that have the most emissions. So start where the problem is. And Oslo is leading the charge on the clean construction work that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. So very, very significant things happening there. Waste management, really important. Short version is we need to compost everything we can, and you need to capture the methane, because if you just let the methane escape through a traditional landfill, it will create very serious problems. It's a very nasty greenhouse gas. It's even better to capture the methane and burn it and create carbon than it is simply allowing the methane to escape to the atmosphere. Some of the most interesting work in this area, though, is not done in North America or Europe. It's being done in Africa, places like Accra. Their biggest source of greenhouse gases is not transportation, it's not buildings, it's waste. And in particular, informal waste dumps in informal settlements. And there's a whole economy around this. And in Accra, a very systematic effort is happening. It was under the leadership of the immediate past mayor, who was quite an amazing mayor, Mayor Soa. Under his leadership, to close the informal dumps, create new properly run landfills that capture the methane, and hire the people involved in the informal economy and the formal economy. So there's an equity component there that's extremely important. Final point I want to make on this is the actions happening globally on transportation, which are remarkable. My main point is, if we're going to succeed in lowering emissions on transportation, we have to ensure that our places are walkable, that they're cyclable, and that there is an excellent public transit network, particularly rapid transit, preferably powered by clean electricity. And in cities that have excellent rapid transit that are walkable and cyclable, you see a far lower proportion of greenhouse gas emissions coming from the transportation sector. And this is a slide from Addis. In Addis, they have contemplated, funded, designed, and built the first light rail transit system in sub-Saharan Africa. They are now considering how to expand it. It's all run by clean electricity. And they've done all of that in the time that in the city of Toronto, we've been debating about whether to build light rail in Scarborough, 3 networks, or for the same cost, expand the subway by 1 stop. I'm being parochial in Toronto, but we've been debating that for a decade. Addis has gone right ahead and built. And one of the things they did, I understand from a previous mayor who got an award for this work, was when they were thinking about the planning, they said, who's going to use the transit? And they determined that the majority of riders would be women. And then they analyzed, what are the needs of the women taking our rapid transit? Where are they going to be going? And the routes were built to accommodate those needs. Things like in that society, women would be considered to be responsible for childcare. So, where are they taking their children in the morning? All of these kinds of things, and very interesting. And I like this example because it shows that we don't just, it's not a world where cities in the developing world learn from cities like Toronto, New York, and London. The learning goes both ways. They can show us very much how to plan, build, operate, and maintain transit in real time, and also how to think differentially about the needs of the riders in a really interesting and thoughtful way. So to me, that's the big picture. But within that, there is so much happening that is fascinating. Shenzhen in China, for example, has completely electrified its bus fleet, over 16,000 vehicles. It's completely electrified its taxi fleet. So when we think about North America, what are we doing to electrify transportation? One of the places we need to start is with fleets, because for technical reasons, it's much easier for cars when they come home to sleep at night to get charged centrally. And it's easier to deal with grid-related issues. It's also a huge proportion of the vehicles on the streets of cities any day. If you think about fleets from couriers to the post office, to buses, to taxis, to electronically dispatched taxis like Lyft, there are a huge number of vehicles. And it's within the power of city governments in Canada. All of those businesses require business licenses to make huge advances, just like Shenzhen in China has. And being Canadian, we're doing, of course, pilot projects with electric buses. Federal government has helped with some funding, but it's on a bit of a slow path. And globally, we should be able to take the learnings from a place like Shenzhen and apply them everywhere. And you've certainly seen the interest in Latin America, hence the announcement at COP about the very significant funding for electric buses. A couple of other things are latest advances, and then I want to speak about how all this comes together using the example of Toronto. So first of all, cities are now pioneering the idea of climate budgeting. So simplistically, it's leading with Oslo, but we now have 14 cities who are involved in a pilot project who are really keen to learn and think about how to do this. And because a whole of government approach is needed, it's not just the environment department that needs to deal with climate, you need everybody to deal with it. Climate budgeting is a way to do this. So simplistically, although it's much more complex, think about Oslo if you need to build a new curling rink. In the past, there would be a political debate about the cost and the utility, and do we really need curling? And yes, of course, the Norwegian curlers wear those fancy pants, but is it a sport that children and youth are using? Is it good for fitness? Okay, the answers to all that are yes. Do we have the money? Let's build it. Climate budget requires you to also say to the question, where does this fit within the carbon budget for Oslo and Oslo's plan to reduce its emissions? And so you have to get carbon budget at the same time you get a financial budget. And the idea of climate budgeting is, how do you introduce that principle across a government, ideally a national government, but city governments are showing the way and dealing with the hard technical issues of how you figure out to embed climate consideration in all of your governmental decisions. So in Toronto's case, for example, council a couple of years ago supported spending $500 million to repair the Gardiner. If you had a climate budget, you would have to answer the question, is that going to help us achieve our climate goals or not? And what are the greenhouse gas implications of rebuilding this highway as opposed to several other alternatives that were on the table at the time that were considered from a transportation perspective and a cost perspective, but not from a climate perspective. Really interesting, and this is cutting edge, so we'll have to stay tuned over the next year or two. Some other things the cities have done: led the divestment movement. New York and London 4 years ago divested from, and Copenhagen their pension funds from fossil fuels. You can see the dates on the left, and then on the right, you can now see this has started to be a global movement. And this is why I am optimistic, although worried, about the possibility of taking some of these great ideas that are happening in a city somewhere and taking them globally, because we've seen it happen. We've seen it happen with divestment. We've seen now the principle behind the C40 cities saying we've got to have a climate plan and take actions in waste, transportation, buildings, and how we generate electricity. In order to do it, we've now seen that principle taken from nearly 100 to over 1,000 cities. And we're seeing movement. The challenge will be making sure that we do these things at scale and pace over the next 8 years. Otherwise, the world won't meet its climate goals. It's that simple. Final point is all of these mayors are ensuring equity, what we call inclusivity in their climate planning. We did significant work about a green and just recovery from COVID, putting equity and climate at the heart of that. And all of the climate plans systematically engage with people from low-income communities and make a real effort to meet their needs, whether it's clean water, clean air, employment, job training, costs of housing, all of those issues. For example, the previous mayor of Lisbon led a huge effort to repurpose short-term holiday rental apartments in downtown Lisbon for workers. And the basic way they did it was outlawing the short-term holiday rentals, and then the city reaching rental agreements with the private owners and them renting below market and below what they were paying to low-income people. Fascinating idea, although I think very politically controversial, but an interesting way of addressing equity in the context of climate, because people are now close to their jobs and don't have to commute using cars or other polluting vehicles. So 5 minutes on how this comes together in Toronto, just as a convenient local example, and then I'm happy to take questions. So Toronto's first climate plan was adopted in 2007. It was called Changes in the Air. It had well over 100 different actions in the areas of buildings, waste management, transportation, and energy generation, or offsetting energy generation. It was updated. It was supposed to be updated every 5 years. It wasn't by my successor, but it was updated after 10 years. And as a result of this plan and of the provincial closure of the Lakeview coal-fired plant, which was a peaking plant that supplied peaking electricity and very polluting to Torontonians and to people west of Toronto and Mississauga. Toronto is now 33% below its greenhouse gas emissions from 1990, even though there's been a huge boom in Toronto. And this isn't the operations of the city. This is the geographic boundaries of Toronto, the 3 million people. The emissions that come from that geographic area are now 33% less because of this plan and the closure of Lakeview. It's really quite extraordinary, and it's an example of what works. And one thing I want to mention in here is, deep lake water cooling, which Toronto did have the power to do, which basically is a pipe out in Lake Ontario and pipes cold water, which is used to cool all of these office buildings in downtown Toronto, more than 60 buildings. And at the time it started, took those buildings off reliance on the coal-fired plant at Lakeview. So a dramatic greenhouse gas reductions, and in a way is a creative response from a city that didn't have the authority to build an electricity plant, but it could build something that substituted for electricity, and it was a world-leading innovation at its time. And think of what is possible if you take that idea to any city that is adjacent to a big body of water, even an ocean, where the bottom is the same temperature virtually all year round. So final point about how this comes together, and I want to look at equity and transportation because they're related. So on the right, is the transportation rapid transit plan of Toronto. It was in the climate plan, and then subsequently, which passed council relatively early in 2007, I think, or maybe late in 2006, actually. And it directed that staff prepare a plan that ultimately became known as Transit City, that was a plan to have light rail transit and a network around Toronto. Why is it a network? It's a network because studies clearly show that people will take rapid transit if there is a network, so they know that they have choice, and if they change what they're doing during the day, they're able to get where else they want to go by rapid transit. And also in Toronto, we know that most people who live walking distance to a subway or to a streetcar or one bus from a subway will choose to take transit as their dominant modal share. But if they're required to take two buses or more, they will tend to choose to take a car if they have a choice. And so the lines for Transit City were built from the perspective of how do we create a network? They were also built from the perspective of where are the busiest bus routes? So where's the demand? And they were built from the perspective of we want an environmentally sustainable system that is permanent and that also welcomes development into Toronto as a bulwark against sprawl, which has negative environmental consequences. So we are going to build on these particular streets that where you could develop mid-rise apartment buildings. I'm going to do it by light rail because it's clean and permanent, encourages development, and creates a rapid transit network because it's running in its own right-of-way, and compared to subways is relatively cheap, about a quarter to a sixth of the cost. That had projected significant greenhouse gas, positive consequences, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but it also had an important social goal. Where are the busiest bus routes? They tend to be serving lower income neighborhoods because people take the bus there because they don't have a financial choice. So if you look on the left, or as I look at this, City of Toronto priority investment neighborhoods, that is a neighborhood-based map of the neighborhoods that the city made a priority for public investment while I was in office. And why were they a priority for public investment? Because our studies showed they had the highest correlation between low incomes and a lack of public facilities like libraries, community centers, job training programs for youth, et cetera, et cetera. So they became our priority, our first priority for investment. And if you look at the two maps, the Transit City routes more or less completely connect those low-income neighborhoods. Almost all of them are on the future routes. One or two have current rapid transit, but almost none of them. The current rapid transit tends to serve the more well-off neighborhoods. So what Transit City did was create a transportation network for Toronto to give people a choice. It gave to not take cars. It lowered greenhouse gas emissions. And it also addressed social inequities by connecting these neighborhoods into the fabric of the city. So when we were consulting with people about Shepherd East, which was the first project under construction, Eglinton is about finished, Etobicoke Finch is under its way. Unfortunately, Shepherd got canceled for political reasons, but that's neither here nor there. When we're consulting, I took the Shepherd bus one morning at 6 o'clock in the morning, had these glossy brochures and was talking to people. And this woman said to me, Mayor Miller, what are you doing on my bus? And I said, I've come to talk to you about the Shepherd East LRT. What's an LRT? Oh, it means light rail transit. It's a European style tram running in the middle of the road that doesn't get stuck in rush hour traffic because it's got its own right of way. It's like having an above ground subway. She said, that would be great. Would really help me. Where are you going? Work. Where do you work? I work at Pearson. How do you get there? Well, I take the bus to the Shepherd East bus, and then that bus to the subway. Then I take the other subway. Then I take the Finch bus. Then I take the Moulton bus, and I get to work if I make my connections on time. I said, well, how long does that take you? 2 hours. I said, wow, you have a long day. And she said, Mayor, that's only my morning job. In the afternoons, I work as a cleaner at the Royal York Hotel, which is bus, subway, and then to get home, subway, bus. That woman probably spent 4 hours a day on transit. And what did that mean? Well, first of all, she's not home for dinner with her family. Secondly, she can't take advantage of educational opportunities she might be able to take in the evening. She lives near Centennial College. You know, my mom went back to school and graduated with a university degree at the age of 56. So she could get upgraded in her job and have one job instead of 1 and 2 part-time jobs. This woman doesn't have that opportunity. And it also prevents her from participating in the democratic life of the city. There was a huge debate about whether Shepherd East should be an LRT or a subway, and as a result, nothing's happened. She could have gone to public meetings and said, this will benefit me. So answering the climate challenge and doing it by smart city building policies also answers really important social challenges. And that's why in the end that I'm optimistic that we will find a way to collectively take these best ideas from 100 leading cities, spread them to 1,000 or more, and actually see us really begin to address our emissions over the next few years. Because the kinds of things that do that are also the kinds of things that transform a city for everyone. And when you transform a city for everyone, from a politician's point of view, that's when you get reelected. So there's a political motive and an ethical motive to actually address climate. I'm crossing my fingers, but to me, it's our best course forward is to build these urban-based climate innovations globally, starting with the best practices from the world's largest cities. Dave, been a bit longer than I intended to, but I look forward to the opportunity to answer some questions.
Great. Thank you very much, David. That was amazing. And it's great to see all the good things that are being done. I must say at the same time that I'm amazed that we haven't seen carbon dioxide concentrations dropping yet. We've got a lot of questions lined up in the chat, about 16 of them at the moment. I'm going to ask the first one, and Art, you're on deck for the second question, Art Hunter. David, I decided I was going to change my question a little bit because I think your presentation answered my first one, which was about why concentrate at the city's level. Rather than that, why is it that cities can succeed at this when nations can't? And in particular, is the difference related in some way to lobbying and political donations?
I think there is a significant part to that, but I go back to the basic functions of cities and mayors. And it depends on what country you're in. Some countries like India and China have appointed mayors. But even in China, they have tasked cities to do better than national government ambitions on climate, which is interesting. But in places where there's democratically elected city governments, there are expectations on council and the mayor to act to address real problems. Allied with that are responsibilities by by city governments, by council and mayor, that, as I indicated at the beginning of the talk, can have, if used properly, a material impact on climate, like transportation, the urban forest, parks, the water system, all sorts of things. And when you put those together, the political environment is ripe for real action to happen. If you add to that the fact that cities globally tend to be the most progressive parts of their country's political ecosystem, we certainly see that in the US. Texas, Dallas, and Houston all voted Democrat. Austin, Texas, Dallas, Texas, and Houston, Texas all voted Democrat in a Republican state. And then add to that the fact that the oil lobby hasn't yet, although it is starting to, focused its efforts on cities. You have a recipe for real action. The challenge, and I'm looking at some of the questions, the challenge is taking things that are happening somewhere and have them happen rapidly at scale. And I shouldn't underestimate that. But the possibility is there because of that recipe. There's less of the direct political interference from the oil and coal lobby, And there is much more of an expectation from residents that mayors and council are actually going to do something, not just say something. Do it. And if they don't do it, they probably won't be back next time around.
Great, thank you. Okay, Art Hunter, you're up next, and Bill Reese, you're on deck.
I was delighted to see you address the fact that there are citizens within the city, but between the citizen and the city are communities and the very important family unit. And these are people who have a considerable amount of flexibility in some of the things which they do and how they conduct their lives. And so the problem, which I didn't quite get a full grasp on from your presentation, of how do you encourage them to understand, and I'm talking of the community, family, as well as the citizen, to understand what the problem is and what you're trying to do, to get a commitment from them and to get participation?
I think there's a layered approach. First of all, most people in most cities understand climate change, but they may not see the connection between this existential issue and their actions, their life, their lifestyle, or city actions. I think that's the key part. And what we see in the best examples are cities quite systematically thinking about how to work with people, listen to people, and talk to people about that issue. And I think the best example is London, England, because it speaks about climate and its needs to address emissions from transportation as a health issue. So what London has done is create this ultra low emission zone, as you probably know, essentially tolls to come into the core of the city. And that was created by Ken Livingstone. It was very politically divisive. Boris Johnson, who was running against him, opposed it. Tony Blair opposed it. Livingstone won, and people loved it in the end. And then Sadiq Khan, who's now the mayor, expanded it. So it was a congestion charge, and now it's an ultra low emission zone. It's going to expand again, virtually cover all of London. And the way they talked to people about that was climate was there, but the key was health, and particularly children's health. And I happened to be in London the day that Sadiq Khan announced the ultra low emission zone. I just happened to be there. I wasn't part of the announcement or anything, although we were as C40. And I watched very carefully the BBC coverage, and it was really interesting because they went to a delivery person first for the opposing view and said, what do you think about this? It's going to cost me £15 a day. What is he doing? You know, you can imagine. Then the pro side, they went to a school and they interviewed a teacher who, behind her, I think she was the headmistress, there was a wall with a rack with little things in the rack. And they said, BBC said, what are those? And she said, those are the asthma inhalers that the students have, because the air quality at our school is so bad, they've all got asthma. And and that happened because the city had prepared the ground for months and months and months. You know, studies of school asthma, you know, meeting with students, all sorts of stuff. And so they had turned a climate issue into a health issue, and it's real. It's a real health issue. And it was brilliant. And it was brilliant because the media didn't even question the narrative. So to me, that's the state of the art of answering that. Second part to this, Art, and I know you're very interested in this personally, is how you engage people at a community level to work collectively on a neighborhood scale or sub-neighborhood scale. And I don't think that's as well done. There's a couple of things that have happened. Barcelona's doing some work around that that's very interesting. They use their public health workers that already work on a block by block basis to work with people on climate issues, but it's more procedural at the moment. But Toronto had a program that unfortunately got canceled called Live Green Toronto, where they had a combination of very small grants to be used for things like community scale solar for the installation and hiring people to work with communities to figure out what they wanted to do. And it was fascinating. In Scarborough, they built a little community garden that you could really describe as a small farm, because that's what people wanted there. They wanted a place to grow food. And boy, the diversity of it was fascinating when you saw the people who wanted to do there. So there's two answers to your question. There's probably many more, but one is preparing the ground and thinking about what are the other ways to talk about this issue, like public health. And then the second is very direct programs to help build community capacity to address things like clean energy and local food production, etc.
Thank you. Excellent reply.
Bit lengthy, sorry about that.
Okay, so we're over to Bill Reese, and on deck we've got Phil Riley.
Thank you very much, David. That was a very enlightening and ebulliently optimistic presentation. I think we all appreciated it. I want to just put what you've said in what I see as the current global context. Right now, emissions are rising again, and by all estimates will continue to do so for some years. This is just globally. We live in a global economy that's still 80% dependent on fossil fuels. Now, you're absolutely right. We need to reduce by 50% in 8 years. But to do that, it doesn't take much to show that to displace 50% of our fossil fuels in 8 years requires building 1.2 times the entire global stock that has been built up over 20 or 30 years of wind and solar installations every year in each of the next 8 or 9 years. So my real question is, in that context, by what measures can the world take, including the things that cities are doing, that can reduce fossil fuel emissions by such an astronomical amount in the next 8 years? Because demand is still rising. We have to understand that every year demand for energy increases faster than we can build wind and solar, for example.
So I don't disagree with your premise, but I find constantly baffling some very highly competent climate scientists and political scientists who look at this always from the big scale and from a national government, and don't really look at what is possible if we start from the ground up, which is essentially where I'm coming, maybe not the ground. But so part of the answer to that is we have to change the curve of needing more energy. So, think about the building stock. When you make the comments that you're relying on, and those studies are out there, there is an assumption implicitly in them that we cannot dramatically reduce the energy use of buildings, and that we cannot convert buildings from polluting sources to clean sources. And I think part of the answer, not all, is that, and knowing that 70% of the global emissions are in cities or can be attributed to what's needed to support them, i.e. a power plant if it's outside the city, knowing that we can make dramatic reductions in dirty energy consumption in areas like managing waste properly in the developing world, in the way we build new buildings, and in the energy consumption of old buildings, and by changing transportation from polluting fuels to clean fuels, and we can do that very quickly, I would argue that they have not really considered or taken seriously the potential of urban-based climate action. I do agree we're very close to the point where we're not going to be able to maintain 1.5 degrees. I think that's right. But the things I'm speaking to are still the exception, not the rule. And if, let's say you take New York City's building mandate of having emissions and apply that all over North America by 2030, that's a massive reduction in energy requirement. Now, I can tell you factually the challenge we're going to have is the natural gas lobby is now going to start fighting cities, and they are. New York said it wants to electrify all buildings using clean electricity, and the natural gas lobby's already fighting it. So I think politically, some of these things will become more challenging than they have been so far. But we're just scratching the surface of what can be done globally. And when you've got these cities, all of whom have significant greenhouse gas reductions, if you think about taking that more broadly over 8 years, there's just about enough time to do that if we act now, would be my argument. But I don't dispute your premise. It's an accurate comment on what's said. I agree.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you.
Okay, for Lurie, you're on deck.
Okay, thank you, David. Very timely for me because I'm in the process here in Ottawa of trying to put together a comment to the planning department relating to subdivision going into CARP, which is a very small little sub-community within the city of Ottawa. And I'm wondering, is there any way of influencing both the municipality and the developer to install electrification and ground source heat pumps and EV charging units and battery to storage types of grids in order to move away from fossil fuel uses for home heating and transportation? And then it's recognizing that it's probably a very difficult argument to make in the planning process. Is there any legal challenge opportunity to go after the municipality to say, hey, hold up your bargain? So I have no idea whether Ottawa is one of your C40 members or not. You're shaking your head?
No, it's not. It's not. Sorry, I should have said this. The cities, generally speaking, are 3 million people or more. So you've
Okay.
got to be of global stature. So Ottawa is not. But go ahead and finish your comment before I interject.
Yeah, so what I'm looking for basically is C40, the organization, able to provide good background information for me for preparing sort of the prelude to my presentation of what is good and what needs to be done, and influencing them to do it so that we're getting away from the same old type of subdivision.
You should be able to find online, I can't remember the name of the organization right now, but there's an organization that promotes sustainable neighborhoods. And the highlights you've said, ground source heat pumps, transportation, all sorts of things, including the way they're built, are really accurate. One place to start might be the Green Building Council, which does have sort of a neighborhood certification. I would take the argument to them and say, this is an opportunity for Ottawa and CARP. By the way, I grew up in Ottawa, and CARP was a completely separate place back then.
It still is.
But this is an opportunity to showcase to the world that you can build a sustainable subdivision. And I would couch it as an opportunity. In terms of the city's powers, the building code's regulated by the province. So what we did in Toronto was we used our planning powers to say you got to build green. Now, we didn't use it for subdivisions because they're not really built in Toronto anymore because we're built out. But we used it for tall buildings in particular. It's called the Toronto Green Building Standard or something like that. And we just used our planning powers. Now, that had to be a bylaw for us to impose those conditions. But it does show you can be creative as a city. And to be creative is really what you're asking. So I think there's an opportunity there to influence them. You won't necessarily be successful, or you should. I get along with Jim Watson pretty well, but he doesn't lead, I think, in the climate thinking. It's not his thing. So he does need a nudge now and then on it. And I'd start with, this is just intuitive, but I'd start with, we have a chance to make this neighborhood a showcase for sustainability in multiple ways, including affordability. and show how it's done in 2 or 3 other places. The developers will push back and say it's too expensive. The counter argument to that is if you build cheap, it's more expensive for the people who buy over time. And if you build properly, it's less expensive for them. So, don't give me that bunk. I'd gives pretty short shrift to that argument because it's nonsense. I don't know if that's helpful, but.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, Ray Lurie, going to be followed by Peter Bolkowski. I'd encourage everybody, in particular, Peter, you want to ask 2 questions. Please keep the questions as short as you can keep them. So over to Ray.
Yeah, I was just trying to show the book there. I've got your book, David. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the presentation. Really good. Actually, I want to go back to discussing Ottawa. And actually, my original question was, why is Ottawa not a member of C40, given that Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver are? And so you answered that question now. And I agree with you that unfortunately, Mayor Watson is not particularly concerned about the environment, if I could put it that way. And I think there's a real issue in Ottawa with builders running council. But anyways, that being said, how can we, is there any other organization like that, or is there a possibility of following or somehow adopting the C40 principles or something of the sort that we could, as a smaller city, that we could go after instead of being a member of C40 directly?
Oui, c'est possible, parce que le RAS à 0, c'est pour toutes les grandes villes du monde, toutes les villes. Je ne sais pas si Ottawa est dans la RAS, je ne sais pas. So that's where I'd start. I'd find out if Ottawa's in the race to 0. There's also the Global Covenant of Mayors, which is 10,000 members. It doesn't have the same high standards as C40, but it's a useful organization. The last thing is C40 does have few members that are smaller that are doing extraordinary things. They're called innovator cities. There isn't a place in North America for one right now, but a couple of our innovator cities are on probation because they've stopped doing extraordinary things. So if they get asked to leave, there would be a space for Ottawa, but they would have to be doing extraordinary things, and they aren't. So
yeah. So
they could,
yeah,
they could lead, right?
Well, maybe an ex-mayor, because we have the mayor is not running for re-election in the fall, so maybe that's an opportunity for the next mayor, right?
It could be, but I would first see if they haven't joined the city's race to 0, they should join, and if they have, you should push them. What's their plan? Because they had to commit to actions. So on the website, it would say the City's Race to 0 website. If you Google it, it's connected to our webpage. You can find it and see if Ottawa's there. And it would have the action areas that they agreed to take, buildings or transportation, whatever it is.
Yes. So they have a fairly detailed plan, but they haven't funded it, which is the big problem I have. But
well, of course, it's got to be funded.
Yeah.
But so you'd be in a position, along with other citizen advocates, to say, you've made this global commitment. You got a plan. How's the plan going to honor your global commitment if you haven't funded? And I think that can become, the media likes those kinds of arguments because it makes the politicians look hypocritical. But I would double check. If they're not in the race to 0, it's not too late for them to sign up.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Ray, we're watching for you to run for mayor. Peter Bolkowski, you're up, and Bill Reese, you're next.
Is that the next step?
David,
by the way, Ray, sorry, Peter, to interrupt. Ray, my middle name's Raymond, so there you go.
David,
Sorry, Peter.
You've made the point that mayors and the city governments are very powerful. I want to look at something from the historical perspective. Housing has become prohibitively expensive within the cities. Young people cannot afford, young people of my daughter's age, who's in her mid-20s, and their friends cannot afford their own house in any of the major cities, Ottawa, Vancouver, Toronto, in the country. That is unsustainable. It is a complete failure of the cities and thus the mayors. How can we trust you to put in place other plans that will not further impoverish working class, middle class people in these cities? That's one question. The second question is, have any of these cities taken their plans, their carbon plans, their climate plans to the citizens in a plebiscite?
So in answer to the second question, Peter, I don't think so. A huge number of them were developed with very extensive public participation, not consultation, participation, like co-development of the plan. Huge numbers, particularly Los Angeles, to some degree Toronto's original plan. But I'm not aware of anybody taking any kind of plan, whether it's a transportation plan, anything else, to citizens in a plebiscite. I may be wrong, I'm just not aware of it. On the housing one, you've got a point. You know, our cities are unaffordable. I do take a bit of a different perspective on, can you trust mayors? I'd say, can you trust premiers? Can you trust prime ministers? Canada Mortgage and Housing, post-war, financed a massive housing boom that was designed to be affordable for troops returning from World War II. You know, I don't think any prime minister has done anything about it either, except stop the affordable housing programs in the early 90s. But I accept your point. I think that is a place where we've failed each other collectively and through our governments. And for me, part of the answer is, you know, we have a system that relies almost entirely on the provision of housing by the private sector for anybody who is not really at the very lowest part of the income scale. And I think we have to look to best practices within Canada and globally, and think about places like Singapore, where there is government-owned housing for middle-class people. And that's important because it takes the value of land out of, you know, it's the value of land and place that's being driven up. So that's one part. There's another part that's a political problem because people in neighborhoods do push back against certain kinds of development. It takes an art to get good development through, and not every politician's interested in that art. It's sometimes easier just to try and fight it and say no. We've also lost the memory of the co-op housing movement, which provided so much affordable housing to Canadians and is highly successful, and needs to be rekindled. And I think if you go back to what we were trying to do in Toronto and think about that transit city map and look at the roads that the lines were on, like Shepherd and Finch, we deliberately put those lines there because they're permanent infrastructure. They're not like bus routes that can get changed. And that means it's a place that you can expect private development and you can do public development. I think we probably, when I was in office, did not do enough public development of housing, although we did a ton at Regent Park. But if you look at Finch, where that line's going, huge parts of it are bungalows. And there's a real opportunity there to build density in a meaningful way that contributes in an environmentally positive way, creates jobs, creates a lot of housing that's affordable. And if it's co-op or government owned, you can keep it at, you know, at middle class prices. So I would accept your premise that all of our governments have failed us in the affordable housing space. And to me, the solutions are far more government involvement in building housing, particularly rental, not just for desperately low income people, but for working class and middle class people. And we need to find ways to rejuvenate the co-op housing movement as well, which I think Canada Mortgage and Housing could have a role in, because that's another way to build affordable rental housing. So those are a couple of answers. I think your criticism is fair. I would just expand it beyond mayors, because they're not the only ones who failed here.
I'd agree that the mayors aren't the only ones who have failed, but thank you for your answers, sir.
Okay, over to Bill Reese and Mary Hegan, you're next. I believe you have two questions. Please keep everything short, please.
Okay, thanks. Hello again, David. I appreciated your emphasis on equity issues. A number of us have been looking for years at something called global carrying capacity. And if we look at just the current population, never mind growth, it would require for sustainability that North Americans, Europeans reduce their energy and material consumption by roughly 80 to 90% in order to enable sustainable growth where it's needed in consumption in the developing world. This would enable us to live within one planet living.
Yeah.
So my question is, do the C40 cities ever discuss that kind of objective or goal, reducing per capita consumption so that their citizens would be living within global carrying capacity, moving us all together toward the concept of living on one planet? Right now, we're consuming resources as if we have about 1.7 planets. So we're literally undermining the biophysical basis of continued existence.
That's a fantastic question. And the answer is yes. Actually, not all, but some of our cities are quite seriously looking at this through consumption-based emissions kind of analysis. We have some pilot projects of what we call thriving cities that are asking the question, how does the city government lead a change to get us back to sort of one planet living? In what can they do effectively? And Portland, Oregon, and Philadelphia, and some Scandinavian cities are involved in that, and maybe Vancouver, I'm not sure. And then we're doing a lot around food from a more explicitly one planet perspective. And there's, what's the organization? There's kind of a one planet diet, which actually gives more protein and meat to people in Africa, for example, and much less to us. But we're working on that. And there's been little elements. I wouldn't go past that, but there's seeding. Like Milan has done amazing stuff around food for their schools and childcares, and trying to align it with both a healthy diet and more of a one planet approach. And that's a place we seem to have some traction, because cities do have jurisdiction in many places over schools or seniors' homes and other places that they have to supply food. So that seems the better in. So the real answer is yes, there's some interesting work being done on this. I didn't highlight it because it's all still pretty piloty and not at the scale it can move. Like the electric buses, everybody should just have them everywhere. Fleet should all be electric, or at least the commitment and then the future purchases. That can happen everywhere, in my view, pretty much now, but subject to the right money being made available. The one planet stuff's a bit harder to get to, but there are elements, there are pieces. And that, I think, is interesting about the fact that the cities are prepared to try that and experiment.
Got to start somewhere. Thank you.
Yep. Well, we're starting with you guys, so keep up the work.
Okay, so Mary is next, and Devin Cantwell Chavez is after that. David, I wonder if I could just interject for a second. Are you okay to continue past 3 o'clock, or what time do you have to leave?
If we could wrap up in about 10 minutes, that would be helpful.
Okay, so I'm sorry, guys. I'm going to have to cut it off after several more questions. We'll see how long the answers are. So over to Mary and then Devin.
Hi, David. You're so timely and inspiring me. I'm a local activist with community associations in Ottawa, and today our heads are swinging because of the provincial task force on housing demanding that we build houses as fast as we can, and a lot less public engagement and get it done. Partly because we want some more affordable housing. We have a housing crisis declared in Ottawa. So it's down to the use of land at the neighborhood level. And even though we're not part of the C40 coalition group, can we go into all your research, your examples? Where do we find these exciting Barcelona type experiments and pilots that are going on that we can apply locally in Ottawa?
So first of all, good luck. Remember that the provincial task force was a task force of developers. So I'm certain, I haven't read it, but I'm certain it doesn't say in there we should build in ways that address climate change and reduce emissions. it's a task force for them to make the most money. Some of the recommendations may still be good, but I'm quite skeptical. Secondly, we have something called the C40 Knowledge Hub. I am just trying to get the link and I'll post it in the chat in a second.
Okay. And specifically on that, a number of our communities in developing their very local climate action plans, both for reducing emissions and adaptation, are very interested in nature-based solutions. Because
Yes.
we get the feeling that we have some instincts that are probably not bad and probably a lot less expensive than some of the taxpayer solutions that senior levels of government often dream up. So do you have in your resource center nature-based solutions that are good, might be working?
I don't know if they're in the Knowledge Hub, but there is a lot of work being done on nature-based solutions in many cities globally. It's really, really interesting, particularly around stuff like dealing with flooding in cities that are near oceans. Nature does a way better job than concrete. But start with the Knowledge Hub, and I think it'll give you change. Secondly, and sorry, I will try to be succinct. Dave, I'm mindful that it's my answers that are causing the problem, not people's questions. I do get frustrated with the federal government, and I don't mean Justin Trudeau, even though I have a different political perspective. I mean the federal government as an institution, because they don't appreciate the bottom up. Neighborhoods can come together in really exciting ways. Cities can do really exciting things. Groups of neighborhoods can do very exciting things. And my example of how wrong they get it, we were doing work with the Junction area in Toronto, which, if you know, it's a very historic area. It was on hard times. The businesses were struggling in the late 80s and early 90s. And they had a business improvement association. And we needed about $100,000, maybe $250,000 to really do something. And Ottawa came in with $1 million to hire consultants to hold meetings that eventually came to the same conclusions we already had, but all the money had been used up in hiring consultants to do meetings to create a new plan. We already had the plan. And they just need to give us a little bit of money. And it drove me out of my mind. And I've seen that happen again and again and again. I really believe in the grassroots up. And I think climate's a collective responsibility. Individuals have a role, but the problems are collective, so we need to resolve them collective. But that can start at a neighborhood and a city. And, yes, of course, Ottawa has a role, but it needs to listen more than it talks, and it does the other way around.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Okay, so we're going over to Devin if she's there, but at the moment it looks like she's muted. Is Herbert Girardet available?
Sorry, I'm here.
Okay.
Sorry, I was just keeping muted.
You're on deck.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you so much for your presentation. I was really interested in the example that you talked about with Addis. And this brought me to think about the fact that for many developing countries, the development pathways look very different than for cities in the global north, as well as access to climate financing, and the threats for climate are much different, right? Much more severe in many cases. I'm curious if there's any other types of examples of global South cities collaborating with other global South countries to share knowledge and development of plans that, or other diffusion from the global South to the global North that we should be tracking, paying attention to as this continues to develop over time.
Great question. Boy, are you on top of stuff. Holy cow. How many PhDs do you have?
I am currently working on my PhD at U Ottawa, so this is my dissertation topic, actually.
So one, soon. I'd look to South Africa, and I'll explain why in a second. But the developing cities in our network, first of all, are outraged about vaccine equity at the moment, and Canada's vote at the World Trade Organization not to waive the patents disgusted people, frankly, in our network. Secondly, they're really concerned about funding for adaptation. It's their big issue. And that's correlated with the informal settlements and absolute poverty and all those kinds of issues that But I'd look to South Africa because there's real innovation happening there. Cape Town, for example, a few years ago sued the national government because the national government wouldn't let it have a solar program. And that shows some real innovation to me. Like, look at Ottawa. It took a citizen to sue to get the trucks to stop honking. You know, why didn't the city take them to court? So I think, you know, this innovation coming at procedural kind of innovation out of Africa is using the courts creatively is really interesting. And we now have a program, and this is what you keep your eye on if you go to our inclusive climate action page. It doesn't update very often because it's, you know, hard work on the ground, but we're working with 5 South African cities, the trade union Koatsu, I think it's called, and the electricity generator, which is mostly coal, to figure out a just transition path to clean energy. And that's really important for all sorts of obvious political reasons. If you're throwing, you know, hundreds of thousands of people out of work, they're not likely to vote for the measures, to say the least. But it's led by the South African cities. And so I think, you know, if they can figure out a just transition path, that's something you could take globally. So it'd be interesting to, you know, go from South Africa to West Virginia, for example.
Thank you so much.
Okay, as it turns out, Herbert has left. Herbert Girardet is with the Club of Rome, apparently. I'm going to ask the question that he put into the chat, and then we're going to go over to Mike Nickerson. We only have a couple of minutes left. So Herbert's question was, how do you deal with the conundrum that the big modern cities stem from the Industrial Revolution as fossil fuel-based systems? Megacities in particular are fossil fuel addicts. Is full-scale conversion to renewables even feasible?
Great question. I have a different starting point, though. Why don't we start dramatically reducing the amount of energy we consume now, which we can. We know we can do it. We can do it in the way we allow development in our cities. We can do it how we build. We can do it how we transport. We can do it whether we make walking and cycling and transit easier and more popular. We can do it by doing energy retrofits on older buildings as we're converting the grid. To me, that's the answer. And you know, the oil industry just keeps pushing this narrative that we're going to have an infinite demand for energy. Well, let's use less. And we know it's possible. There's a study that shows that if you did relatively inexpensive external insulation on all of the multi-unit residential apartment buildings in Toronto, the greenhouse gas emissions would be lowered by 5%, and it would pay for itself between 7 to 10 years, depending on the price of natural gas. There's all sorts of things like that we can do. And I think that's the place to start because it does answer the conundrum of how do you address the energy transition. Second part is storage is moving along a lot. Very interesting. And a third part of that is we're not even remotely tapping the potential of ground source type energy. Every city park should be a little energy generator for all the buildings around it, for example. Nobody does that. Mm-hmm. And I was told as mayor that we couldn't do it because it was an improper subsidy for people to use the park. I'm like, what? You get tired of fighting with lawyers, but
every parking lot could have solar panels too.
Well, there's all sorts of things you can do. Like, starting to do them is the bigger issue to me.
Right. Okay, Mike Nickerson, you're going to get to ask the last question. I'm afraid we got 4 or 5 others that are in the queue, but we're just not going to have time. So I'm going to encourage you to hold your questions until the coffee time afterwards. So, Mike.
Okay, well, thank you very much for what you have to say. I'm encouraged. I didn't realize there was so much scope in municipal activities. My interest is consumerism. We are enormously caught up in the whole notion of buying stuff, and we came out of a culture where we were focused more on what we could do with each other or learn or appreciate or help out with. And is there any discussion in the municipal, in the discussions you have with other cities about influencing the culture of cities away from consumerism and more perhaps towards enjoyment of life?
Yes, is the answer to that. There is some very interesting discussion And it's allied with the work I spoke to before, the Thriving Cities work with cities like Portland. And it, ultimately, really, I don't know if people here are aware of the economist Herman Daly, but you're really talking about, what's the purpose of the economy? And to me, I didn't, I wasn't born the mayor of Toronto. And I lived as a young boy in a small farming village in England. And it was completely different. We had almost nothing by modern standards. And there was a rag and bone man who came around, and if you had something broken, he would fix it. And if you couldn't fix it, he would take it and fix it and resell it to someone else. Like, there was an entirely different sensibility of life. Now, probably changing that entire feeling of people that we get satisfied by consumerism and buying stuff might be beyond the pay grade of mayors, but there's ways for mayors to do some things that help change that feeling. And I think the pandemic in a way might help in that, because we learned that public parks really matter. Where does your soul get joy? It gets it out there. When you shut up all day, you go to the park for a walk. And these public assets, as opposed to privately purchased assets, have started to be seen to be more valuable. So I think there's an opening, but it really, really needs a big, big concerted effort, and it's societal change that I think some cities at least for sure are allies in, but nobody has quite figured out how to move materially along. I think
remove the tax exemption for advertising would be a start. We circulate the catchphrase "more fun, less stuff."
I like that. I like more. That's a great way to end this. More fun, less stuff.
Okay, we're going to go over to Jean Doherty. She's the chairperson of the board of directors of the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, and she's going to give you a quick thank you.
Well, what can I say? On behalf of the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, I would really like to take it's my pleasure and my privilege to thank you so much for a very informative and wonderful presentation that you gave us today. It was enlightening, and it was invigorating, because it gave you some positive things to think about. Sometimes it can get quite down when you hear things about climate change, but this has been really, really positive. And thank you so much for that. For those of you who are new to this particular seminar series, you can go to our website, thecanadiancor.com, and you can see the presentation that David has given us. It's being taped, and you will be able to get access to this particular presentation later on. If you go to the Stay Informed section and subscribe to getting our Stay Informed, you can see all of that information whenever you want. In addition to that, if you wish to join the CACOR, Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, the information about who we are and how to become part of our group is there available for you. And we would very much appreciate any of you who wish to see and become involved in what we do. And David, again, thank you so much. This was just a wonderful presentation and a great addition to our Zoom series. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jean, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.